Welcome back to Global Media Network, LLC. Passionate World Talk Radio is a wholly owned subsidiary of GMN LLC. Our motto is and always will be educate, enlighten, and entertain. And today on Lest We Forget with host Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and I, Lillian Cauldwell, we are going to be talking about feral children, or plainly put, children who are raised by animals, whether it's mistake, whether it's intentional, or whether parents just disappear somehow and the child is left on their own devices. So we are going to start first with Lisa Skinner, who is going to delve into the question of nurture versus nature. Take it away, Lisa.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for a new episode of Lest We Forget Historical. And this may not appear to be an episode that really has to do with atrocities like the theme of our episodes typically are. I think maybe some of us can consider this topic an atrocity, but the three of us really thought it was such a fascinating topic that we wanted to do some more research on it and share with you what we find, because it's really fascinating once you peel the layers of the onion back and understand how these children who were raised by wild animals and then rescued, and the similarities between what was observed after they were rescued. So it really begs the question about human development, and we're going to kind of take a deeper look into that whole concept of human development and relate it to children who were literally raised by wild animals and then tried to assimilate them back into human society. So one of the things that I discovered is that there actually are over 100 documented cases of kids raised by animals and who were living in the wild in history. Over 100 documented cases. I know that there's a lot of stories out there that are mythical, but these are actual true stories, and over 100 children that were rescued. So this isn't even counting for the children that were never found or rescued, or that we're aware of being raised. So the first question that I think comes to a lot of our minds is, how were these children adopted by wild animals in their situation of either being kidnapped and dumped off or abandoned by their parents, when wild animals instinctively would hunt a human child or baby as prey? And every one of these cases demonstrates that the wild animals took these abandoned children, lost children, under their wing and raised them as their own. And we are talking about a variety of different animals. So I'm going to share with you a few of the stories that I just wanted to kind of make some points about. Being away from human civilization for a long time and responding to the necessity to survive in the wild, these feral children have adopted traits of animals in the woods. So that was definitely a similarity that was noted between every single one of these children who were eventually rescued that had been raised by wild animals. So Let me just share with you a couple examples. There was a little girl by the name of Marina. She spent 5 years in the wild, and she was raised by monkeys. So when she was rescued, she walked on all fours, just like the monkeys. She slept in holes in the trees, and she completely lost her ability to communicate. By the time she was found, she had no language capabilities whatsoever. She basically made sounds like her monkey family. Then there was Bello, who was also adopted by chimpanzees, and they raised him. He walked on his 2 legs, but he did drag his arms on the ground, just like his chimpanzee family members, and he leapt about, shrieking like an ape. He had no human communication skills. He had zero command of the English language or any language. And then the other example was Dina, and she emerged from a wolf's cave. This is a boy named Dina. He initially exhibited all the habits of a wild animal. He would tear off his clothes, did not want any clothes on, and when they were trying to assimilate him back into human society, if they put clothes on him, he would literally tear them off with his teeth. He didn't understand why mankind was trying to dress him. This was foreign to him. He ate his food off the ground. He preferred raw meat, and that was a consistent theme in all of these stories. And he too walked on all fours. Now, he was eventually weaned off of the raw meat and onto cooked food, but he never did learn to speak. And he also, which was common with a lot of these kids who were rescued, they gnawed on bones to sharpen their teeth. And a lot of these kids that were found, they had really sharp teeth like animals do, because they do gnaw on bones for that purpose, to sharpen their teeth, to pull raw meat off of their kill or to make the kill. So that was a real consistent observation in most of these cases. So there's 3 examples for you. And as I mentioned, there are over 100 documented cases, and there are definitely, I went through a lot of them and found, basically a common observation to most of these kids. And the other common observation is very few of these children ever learn to talk, with, as Lillian said, with the exception of a couple of stories. And it may just have been due to their particular circumstances, like maybe they were older, or I'm not really sure. But out of over 100 documented cases, there were only a select few that ever learned to talk after they were rescued. So, this really begs the question of human knowledge is constructed rather than inborn. And are we seeing that the ability of such children to master language is due to their unique histories of survival outside of the human society, as a behavioral mechanism specifically adapted to their environment and circumstances, rather than being a biological inability? So let's take a deeper look at that concept and relate it to the feral children. So I did some research on child development, and this is what I have uncovered, and it's absolutely fascinating and really supports the way these children, after they were rescued, kind of the result of their childhood experience. So basically, lack of childhood development, which is the growth of perceptual, emotional, intellectual, and behavioral capabilities during childhood. This is a critical period of our lives. Childhood denotes the period in the human lifespan from the acquisition of language, which occurs at 1 or 2 years of age, to the onset of adolescence at 12 or 13 years of age. Many of these children were void of their childhood development phase for obvious reasons. And during this phase, they also, children learn to transform information that they gather about the world around them. So in their circumstance, that was an impossibility. They had no opportunity to do that. They form the beginning of logic during the childhood development phase in normal circumstances. They form the beginning of logic, and their memory capacity advances continuously during childhood. This is the period of time where they start to demonstrate an increasing speed of recall and can search their memories for information more quickly and efficiently and apply it to their lives. This didn't happen for these feral children. They adopted and adapted the way of life of the animal, the type of animal culture that they were adopted into. So during the phase of development, children are growing in awareness of their own emotional states, characteristics, and abilities to develop empathy, which is the ability to appreciate the feelings and perspective of others. So empathy and other forms of social awareness are in turn very important in the development of a moral sense. This is really the beginnings of developing our morals and our values. The formation of the self-concept happens during this phase, or of course, our identity. In other words, their sense of who they are and what their relationship to other people is. So being raised by wild animals, I'd say it's pretty difficult to develop an identity towards the human race when you're surrounded and you only know a wild animal existence. For example, the sex role identity based on gender is probably the most important category of self-awareness and usually appears by age 3. Now, I thought that was really fascinating. I didn't realize that it developed at such a young age. So the reality of feral children is that they lack the basic social skills that are normally learned in the process of what is called enculturation. And enculturation, by definition, is the process by which an individual adopts the patterns of the culture in which he or she is immersed. So that makes total sense. Every one of these children were immersed in an environment of living in the wild as an animal. So it supports the patterns, the behavioral patterns of these feral children that lived in the wild and were rescued and observed. So as it turns out, these children, as I mentioned, almost all of them had impaired language, with a few exceptions, and impaired mental function because they missed the role of socialization in their human development phase. The impaired ability to learn language after being isolated for years is often to the existence of a critical period for language learning. And the definition of the critical period refers to the window of time during which a human needs to experience a particular environmental stimulus in order for proper development to occur. That makes total sense. They missed this critical period. So, was it too late for them after they were rescued? It appears in most of these cases that it was. Feral children, as it turns out, lack the basic social skills that are normally learned during this process of enculturation. For example, they may be unable to use a toilet, have trouble learning to walk upright again, or maybe they never did, and display a complete lack of interest in the human activity around them. This was another observation that was made of these rescued children. They often seem mentally impaired and have almost insurmountable trouble learning human language. That was probably the biggest deficit they found in these children. It is theorized that if language is not developed, at least to a degree, during the critical period, a child can never reach his or her full language potential. And this is exactly what has been observed in the rescued feral children, with a couple of exceptions. So this really leads us to the phenomenon, the debate of nurture versus nature. Nature refers to how genetics influence an individual's personality, whereas nurture refers to how a person's environment, which includes relationships and experiences, impacts their development. Whether nature or nurture plays a bigger role in personality and development is one of the oldest philosophical debates within the field of psychology. Nature refers largely to our genetics. It includes the genes we are born with and other hereditary factors that can impact how our personality is formed and influence the way that we develop from childhood through to our adulthood. Nurture, on the other hand, encompasses the environmental factors that impact who we are. This includes our early childhood experiences, the way we were raised, our social relationships, and the surrounding culture. So this is all very, very consistent with what was observed in these feral children after being rescued. So the nature versus nurture debate centers on the contributions of genetics and environmental factors due to human development. Some philosophers, such as Plato and Descartes, suggested that certain factors are inborn or occur naturally regardless of environmental factors. This is one theory. Now, advocates of this point of view believe that all of our characteristics and behaviors are the result of evolution. They contend that genetic traits are handed down from parents to their children and influence the individual differences that make each person unique. Other well-known thinkers, such as a man by the name of John Locke, believed in what is known as tabula rasa, which suggests that the mind begins as a blank slate at birth. According to this notion, everything that we are is determined by our experiences. Behaviorism is a good example of a theory rooted in this belief, as behaviorists feel that all actions and behaviors are the results of conditioning. So that really is what makes these stories so fascinating, because everything in these over 100 documented cases of children being raised by wild animals points to the behavioral theory of development versus that everything we are is passed down through our genes. So, think about that, and maybe you can decide for yourself if you think what you think based on these stories that we've shared with you. It's really a fascinating topic. So with that, I am now going to turn the floor over to Lillian, and she will continue where I left off. Lillian?
Yes. When you read two books, Tarzan and Mowgli, they were both raised by feral animals. One was the giant apes, and one was a pack of wolves. But they never tell you where they learned their English from. It's amazing. And that's called poetic license, folks. Do not mix up children who are raised by animals as a romantic venture. Some of these kids did land up because they were kidnapped, and when the parents could not pay the ransom, they just abandoned them in the middle of the forest or the jungle. One or two of the cases where the parents were drug addicts or alcoholics, and they actually crawled into dog houses where there were kennels kept, and they got more love from the dogs who were domesticated, but they were dogs nonetheless, who kept them warm and fed them, and the parents never bothered to reclaim them. And then you have the kids whose parents maybe died in the wild, and they were picked up as babies. And it's very unusual for babies to survive in a wild environment. So please do not get caught up in the romanticism of a child being brought up by a wild animal. Now, why do these kids have trouble picking up a language? Because a child who is deaf and cannot hear but can speak, and they say it's because of the vibrations of hearing the voice and the sound that enables them to reproduce the sound that is uttered. And without hearing or hearing the vibrations of the sound, they're not able to pick up on the language. So one of the things you can say is that when they were being brought up by the wild animals, a wild animal wasn't going to start speaking Spanish to them, or Italian, or French, or Chinese. It just knew its own language, which is a series of whistles, growls, guttural growls, movements with their feet, with their tail. And that's how the child picked it up. And if they don't hear the sound or how to form a letter or a consonant with their tongue, the top of their mouth, or their teeth, or their lips, then they're not going to learn it because they cannot hear it. Now, back in the 1800s, when the Indians kidnapped boys and girls, very ironically enough, you had the same type of experience. Why? Because the indigenous people were considered savages, and savages are about 2 steps higher on the animal ladder than animals themselves. Most white people felt that they were animals. So when these kids were kidnapped by the various tribes and they learned the language of the various tribes, and then were either sent back or rescued by the cavalry to be reunited with their white parents, a good many of them ran away or left to go back to the Indians because they learned from an early age the language, the customs, the mannerisms of the indigenous Indians, and they did not want to have anything to do with the white people. And if you follow this to its logical conclusion, many of these white captives that lived among the indigenous people, they were ridiculed, they were insulted, they were put in asylums. Their own family wouldn't have anything to do with them because they considered them ruined when they got them back from the indigenous people. And that is no different from how a lot of these kids who were picked up by their so-called rescuers, who deemed that these kids were either idiots or stupid because they would not pick up on their language or the humans' mannerisms or culture. And you cannot judge a child by how they're brought up. Now, early in the 1900s, a gentleman by the name of John Appleton decided that feral children who became feral adults belonged to a new kind of human being, and he called them Homo ferens, Ferens, which was then considered the sixth type of distinct human species. However, by the 1900s, there was a gentleman from France, Etienne Bonnet, who declared that these people were human and they just had the unfortunate experience of being raised by animals, but they still should be treated like humans. So the discussion I'm bringing you forth is that should these children be returned back to whence they come to finish out their lives with the animals who they consider family? Should they remain in custody of the humans who rescued them and force them to become like them, even though their nature is wild? Or should they be condemned and put into an asylum or into prison or locked in a room because man himself does not want to be reminded that he too is an animal, a human animal? So, Betsy, what do you think? That was not nice. I should have waited until you took your drink of water. Sorry. Bad
That's
time.
okay. That's all right. Wow. It's mind-boggling, truly mind-boggling. I was so saddened to watch some of these YouTube videos about children that were raised by animals that I got me so upset I couldn't watch it anymore because it's just heartbreaking. Children, as Lillian and Lisa said, were abandoned by their parents. They could have had learning disabilities, which they didn't know about back then. You know, they had trouble speaking. Maybe a child was deaf. Maybe they had a Down syndrome or hearing disability, and they abandoned them. Also, if a family was poor, they just, dumped them somewhere. I did watch this morning. I forgot to write the person's name down, Lily, when you were talking about being in a dog kennel. This girl in Australia her parents put her out and she made her way into their dog I call it dog kennel, dog house, and she was raised by the dogs. And she was on all fours, barking, eating a raw meat, and it's just devastating. There is a child, Andrei Tolstoy, who in 2004, he was raised by dogs for in Siberia, in a remote part of Siberia, from 3 months to 7 years. He was neglected by his parents because he had speaking and hearing problems. Now, I forgot to write down what animals took care of him. I'm thinking probably wolves in that section of the country.
Yes.
And also, can't pronounce this guy's name, the most famous. This was in the late 1700s to 1828. Victor of Aveyron, Aveyron, a French feral child, was found at age 9. He's the most documented. And again, I'm sorry, I forgot to write down what animal. It's heartbreaking to think that parents can actually do that to their children. And I know some animals, they eat their young, but then some animals, they're very nurturing to their own. I find it fascinating and watching. I love to watch about the animals, like the lions. How does the lion know how to bite down on their child's neck without breaking it, like they bite on someone's neck to paralyze them when they are hunting? That's how they kill them. They jump on them and they bite their neck. I just think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating as to how did these animals know to take care of this child instead of attacking them, as what Lisa had said in her presentation. How do they know? I'm sure the animals realized that that was a human child, and for them not to eat that child or kill it, to me, is really miraculous. That they nurtured that human. And it must have been very difficult for a child to readjust. I mean, just imagine you being taken in by animals to adjust to wearing clothes, eating with utensils. You don't have the language skills. And depending what age the child was found, that's kind of hard to readjust to. There's children, they don't know English. They learn it very quickly, which is what I discovered when I was in preschool. These children didn't know English, but in a few months, they picked it up very quickly. Were these children able to pick some language up? And then again, depending on how old they were when they were discovered. But I would imagine how frustrating it must have been for that child to be readjusted, to try to readjust into society. And what kind of parents, really, you think about it, could just dump their child out in the wilderness somewhere? Animals take better care of their young better than some human parents. I just think it's a disgrace for parents to do that. Maybe there was no shelters at that time. Maybe there was no place for them to place their child at that time, depending what year it was, where they lived. But not to care about your child, something's wrong. Something's wrong with those parents, because it's a natural instinct to protect your child, whether you're a mom or a dad. You had that instinct to protect your child at all costs. I would die for my child. I would stand in front of my child and take a bullet for my child. And I would go after anyone who tried to hurt my child. So when you think of someone just abandoning their child out in the woods, out in the jungle, something is wrong with them. What is wrong with them? I don't know. Maybe their maternal instinct is screwed up from how they were raised. Usually multi-generational trauma is passed on, and abuse is passed on from generation to generation. And I also saw in what I read that there are many documented cases. If anyone wants to watch, go on YouTube, excuse me, and you can see all kinds of cases of children and how they're eating with their hands and they're barking. If they were raised by dogs or wolves, it's on one hand it's fascinating, and on the other hand it's very sad. And I think that's what all I have to say. So thank you very much for listening. I just think that, now in this 21st century, I just want to put this out there. Parents, if you don't know how to raise a child, then go seek out workshops to learn how to be a parent. If you don't want your child, drop them off in a safe place. Take them to the hospital. Take them to a daycare. Don't just abandon them on the street to be abused. You can't take them to a hospital. You can't take them to a shelter. There's no reason in this day and age to abandon a child out on the streets, out in the jungle. That's my opinion. Thank you very much.
I think that our culture, even though it's modern, still has the behavior of our ancestors, where if the child was not born with all 10 fingers and 10 toes, or there was an obvious defect, or you were poor, they used to take them out and abandon them because they weren't good enough to keep around. And when you read stories about babies being found in dumpsters or babies found in abandoned newspapers somewhere, it's really impossible to wrap your mind around that. And you may hear from these people saying, well, I didn't know I was pregnant. Really? Or I didn't know I was going to be giving birth. Really? I got to tell you, when I gave birth, it was all natural, and it was like Mount Vesuvius dividing in my stomach area for a good 15, 20 minutes. Don't tell me that it didn't hurt, lady, because it does. I mean, I was told I had one of the fastest deliveries in that hospital since it opened. It only took 20 minutes. Come on. And I was still answering questions about registration because they lost my registration papers. That was before the miracle machine, the computer. But the thing of the matter is, if you don't want a child, then don't have sex. It's pretty easy. Or protect yourself. But please don't tell me you weren't pregnant. That show, I didn't know I was pregnant on TV. Seriously? I find that very hard to believe. However, children are special, and not everybody can have a child. There are plenty of couples out there that would give their right arm to have a child, but for whatever reason, I can't have one. And there's no romance. I mean, how would you like it if a Yeti came by with a human child that they raised from birth? Although I have to admit, some of the parents I've met are like Yetis anyway, because they don't know how to raise a child and the child just raises themselves. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about feral children who are raised by animals, who have an almost impossible task of coming back and being rehabilitated. There's only one child that I read about. She was a little girl, and she was rehabilitated, and she joined the African choir, and it was written about. But I think out of all the other children that have been rescued or found, they have never really adopted being human because they spent their early development years with animals. And those development years pack a lot of punch. There's an old saying that the Jesuits used to say, Give me a child when they are young, and by the time they're 8, they're ours for life. And the reason behind it is they knew that if they had instruction of that child from birth until 8 years old, they could indoctrinate that child. And no matter what happens afterwards, that child would always be theirs, interested in their religion, their culture, and they wouldn't stray because that's all they were introduced to and reinforced all their lives. So, ladies and gentlemen, besides looking out for the traffickers in your neighborhood, be on the lookout for abandoned kids who are living off the streets, because a lot of them are not teenagers. A lot of them are under the age of 10, and they have no place else to go. So you are your brother's keeper, whether you want to think you are or not. Because if you're not out there to prevent these acts or to turn them around, these kids won't be kids. And they'll be lucky if they survive into their teen years. So, ladies, let's tell our call to action is please go over to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/groups/less-we-forget-historical. Leave a comment. I know 2/3 of you spend most of your life on Facebook. I've seen evidence of that. So please, or leave something on Instagram. So it's instagram.com/@PWTR or twitter.com@PWTRN or Facebook. If you don't like Lest We Forget Historical, try facebook.com/Passionate World Talk Radio. That's your call to action for today. Lisa, please leave your email so they could contact you if they want to hear more about the information that you have on feral kids.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing because we have presented human trafficking on several occasions in this series. And I just realized the obvious and strong correlation between feral children and the children who are victims of human trafficking. In fact, one of our episodes, we talked about the rehabilitation homes that have been set up for the rescued kids who have been trafficked before, where they can learn some life skills and before they are reintroduced to human society. And if I remember correctly, sharing with everybody that a lot of those kids do not successfully make it back in society because of the impact that their experience had. So this is very similar to, you know, what we've presented with the feral children too. But unfortunately, the human trafficking situation is much more prevalent and much more serious, as we've discovered. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And I think it's a lot more likely that you will run across a human trafficked child that was put in similar circumstances and environment as we just talked about with the feral children. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out because it kind of dawned on me as as Betsy and Lillian were talking, what a strong correlation there was between our topic today and the trafficked children, because they are taking them at young ages and then they're rescued, and a lot of them end up not being able to assimilate back into, you know, a normal lifestyle because of the damage done. So anyway, if you want to send me a message, I would love it. And my email address is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you for another episode of Lest We Forget Historical next week.
Betsy?
Lisa, I had to add, since you were talking about the human trafficking, I heard a story this week of a mother giving over her 5-year-old to a 75-year-old man.
I think I read about
in New York City.
too. Yeah. She needed the money or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So folks, don't think this isn't going on.
No.
It is going on. It's going on in our neighborhoods, right under our noses.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, how many times, this might be a little off, but I'll just bring it up since we're talking about it. How many times have you heard of these wackos having soundproof rooms so that when visitors came over, they didn't hear these girls? And then people were shocked. Oh, I didn't know that was going on, because they were in soundproof rooms. You've heard of these people escaping. I can't think of her name. Was it named JC? It was out west. 18 years she was kidnapped.
Oh, that was JC Dugard. Yeah, and she was kidnapped from a bus stop in South Lake Tahoe, and kidnapped by a couple, and they kept her prisoner for 18 years.
Yes.
Yeah, it was tragic. But she did. She did. She kind of lives a pretty normal life now. I'm very close to that story. So yeah, it's.
And she had 2 kids by that guy.
She did. She did.
Yeah.
And the wife knew about it.
You know, it does happen. And
well, Lillian's son was a victim of an almost kidnapping situation. Yeah. She has firsthand experience of that.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for listening. My email address is Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY 31@gmail.com. And let us know what you think of the show. Any comments, suggestions, just send us an email, and see you next week. Thank you.
And you can be anonymous. Send it to pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. Send it off. You'd be surprised. In fact, on our website, Passionate World Talk Radio, there's a form that you can fill out. If you want to be a potential host on the station, you can leave your comment right there. You don't have to give me your email if you don't wish to, but if you have something to say, you can use that form. That website's been up for 3 years now, and I've yet to see anybody put in, I want to be a talk show host. I get everything else through that form. So if you want to be anonymous, please use that form. Everybody else does, trying to sell me what they have and what they think I want or what I need. So thank you very much for joining us. Next week, Lisa Skinner is going to be off, personal reasons. So Betsy and I are going to do a review of many of the shows we have done previously. So please stop in and take a listen. Thank you very much and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.